we have been learning, and we have been growing, and we have been discovering things, and hopefully all the new things that we've learned and discovered have led to a deeper and more intimate relationship with Jesus. I thought this thought the other day, that nothing that I do as a minister is accidental or unintentional. I bring stuff into the church, and I say things from the front here with that being my only objective. That of bringing you into a more personal relationship with Christ. When I thought of having a cross in church during this journey towards Easter, I didn't just do it because I could or because it's something different to do. My intention was for us to walk with Jesus through this period as Lent unfolded and to become aware of the reality of Calvary. On Ash Wednesday, the cross was right at the back in this corner, and it's now slowly moved little by little, Sunday after Sunday, more and more to the front. And on Good Friday, it will be right here on center stage, so that no one finds it possible to ignore it or to evade it. For there comes a definite time in all of our lives where we have to decide what we will do with the crucified Christ. Where we come eyeball to eyeball with the truth of the cross of Calvary. And of course it makes us feel unsettled. The fact that God would go to this extreme measure to bring us home and to reconcile Him to Himself. And that's the point. For the last thing that I would want is for this upcoming Easter to just be another Easter, without us as a people being challenged and or changed. And so I trust that you will invest as much time and energy as possible in the next 2 weeks. The program has been prepared with lots and lots of prayer and with great care, with that as the objective, for all of us to end up with a deeper, more profound relationship with Jesus, the Savior of sinners, the light of the world. We don't have any flowers on stage during this season, and that's not because it's the usual practice. It's also an attempt to make us aware that this is a serious time, where we are expected to pray, perhaps more intentionally, and even mourn our sinfulness. In the more mainline parts of the church, like the Catholic Communion and the Anglican Communion, they have altar pieces which are purple, drawing people's attention to the reflective mood of the Lenten season. And so we need to prepare our inner chambers for what lies ahead in the next 14 days. We have been awakened to the author of the first gospel, who is Mark. First gospel, chronologically speaking, of course. People like to correct me, saying, how can a minister who's worked in the church for 20 years constantly get it wrong? Because of course the first gospel is Matthew. But when one puts them in a timeline, Mark will always be first because it appeared before the others. And so as we've been studying the work of Mark's gospel, I trust that we have found a whole lot of gems that shape us and mold us more into Christ-likeness. Today's sermon is based on a passage which focuses on the crowd. Focusing on the crowds and how people in their thousands found themselves fascinated and intrigued by the character of Jesus of Nazareth. Right early on in Mark's Gospel, do we have an incident recorded where a house where Jesus was preaching and teaching was so crowded that there wasn't place for even a half person to still fit in after the gathering began. We have it written in Mark chapter 2 of how a group of about 4 friends were desperate to get their friend to Jesus to be healed from his paralysis. They had to innovate and quickly devise a plan, and I'll give that to them. What they did was quite impressive. They found a way of making a hole in the ceiling and then worked together to lower their friend into the room below where Jesus was busy demonstrating the kingdom. Of course, we're not going to now focus on that miracle. We did that in the teachings on Mark. The point I'm trying to make is, even as early on as in Mark chapter 2, do we have crowds thronging around Jesus, not wanting to miss out on anything that he said and did. In Mark chapter 3, we have it recorded by the Gospel author, who was Mark, of course, telling us that people came from far and wide just to get a glimpse of this newfound, dare I say, celebrity. For Jesus had become popular almost overnight. Mark said there that the people trying to get to Jesus were coming from Judea. They were coming from Jerusalem, which is quite strange that he mentions Jerusalem separately to Judea, because Jerusalem is a city in Judea. Perhaps it's Mark pulling out some dramatics, wanting to let the reader know that people all wanted to do one thing, and that was to get to Jesus. Mark also mentions that they came from Idumea. Now, I don't even know where Idumea is, but it sounds like it could have been a considerable distance to travel from wherever that was to where Jesus was busy demonstrating the kingdom of God. Mark then isn't finished with his list at that stage. Mark then says, not only are there people from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, there are also people who crossed the Jordan to come and just be close to Jesus, and perhaps to try the possibility of them even just touching the hem of his garment. So in Mark chapter 3, you will see all these places referred to. In Mark chapter 3, the Decapolis is mentioned. People came from the eastern side of the Jordan River. Can you imagine what a trek that must have been? Can you imagine the time, the energy, the money spent on that trip? Word that Jesus wanted to protect so earnestly got out. Remember, in Mark we have the messianic secret, where Jesus constantly tells people who found out who he was to hush and to keep it a secret. He wasn't ready for his identity to be widely known. But of course, this sort of thing can't be kept secret. And so, almost right from the very start, Jesus was not only well known but famous. The Decapolis is a gathering of 10 Greek cities. Only one of them, Psylopolis, is on the western side. The other 9 cities, which are Greek, in the Decapolis would have been on the other side of the river, in other words, the eastern side. So if Jesus was teaching in Galilee, it would have been a substantial distance to travel to get to where he was. But it looks like the general populace wasn't put off by that. Not even miles and miles of awkward traveling were going to put them off. And then Mark adds just for good measure, another little bit of info. Mark says that people even from Sidon and Tyre, two cities on the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea, also traveled after they heard the word of Jesus. I suppose the closest we can come to this sort of number today would be when many people lined the streets when Her late Majesty the Queen visited a country or a city. Or perhaps nowadays the Pope would draw that same kind of appeal worldwide. Who can ever forget when Pope John Paul II went to South America and he met with young people on Copacabana Beach? 3 million teenagers went to meet with the Holy Father. And his opening statement of that preaching was, because it was the time of the Soccer World Cup, and we know that South America is soccer crazy, the Pope opened his speech with the words, "Jesus offers us much more than a World Cup." I digress, however. So in our mind's eye, we should have a very clear picture of how people thronged from all over the place to get to Jesus. The passage we are looking at this morning follows shortly after Jesus having a picnic with 5,000 people. The feeding of the 5,000 is also in Mark chapter 6, which is the chapter from which we take today's passage. When one wants to be technical about the feeding of the 5,000, one can actually make it a little bit more complicated, because the Gospel authors tell us that the males alone present on that day numbered 5,000. So that wouldn't have included women and children. Jesus made sure that everybody there did get at least a bite. Let's look at this morning's passage. Mark 6, verses 53 to 56. For those who were hoping for there to be a speck of dust in my eye, there's been no such luck. When they had crossed over, so Jesus actually had asked for a boat to jump into to get away from the crowds for a little bit. He just needed a break. You know how exhausting dealing with people can be. He had commanded his disciples to get a boat so that they could go to the other side of the lake. And this is what waited for them there. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And everywhere he went, into villages, into town, and the countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. Now this is the weirdest thing out. I mean, aren't markets where you sell fruit and veg and things like that? But this is what people did even there, where people were trading over the price of chickens. That's where they placed the sick. They begged him to let them touch even the hem of his cloak. And all those who did so were healed. There was something about Jesus that people needed, that people wanted, that people longed for, that people craved for even. You see, Jesus was challenging broken lives. Jesus was challenging the oppressive systems of his day. And to those who were lucky enough to get close to him, they picked up his love, his care, his mercy, and also his power and his authority. His preaching was dynamic. His personality was impressive. And every word that fell from his mouth, people wanted to lap up and ask for more of. There was something about Jesus similar to what the Pied Piper would have had, where people just couldn't resist being close to him. Jesus was on a mission to transform the world in love. Now, if our mission is not similar in nature, then I don't know what we're doing. The simple but not easy question that I want to leave with us today is this. Are you, let me include myself there, are we or are we not a magnet for Christ? Are we living our lives in such a way that people are attracted to Jesus? That people feel drawn to the church? Are we making Jesus irresistible? Surely the way in which we love and the way in which we show generosity and the way in which we insist on forgiveness even when we don't want to, surely all that stuff needs to speak volumes, not of only who we are, but whose we are, and who we claim to follow. Surely our lives need to be magnets for Jesus, where we prove to all those we meet that we are His, and that serving Him is the only way, that there is no other life worth living. Surely our faith should be infectious. Surely the way we love must make others not be able to say no to Jesus. Surely our attitude to life alone should bring others in over and over and over again. Here's the problem. The problem is that I have seen many Christians, perhaps it's not past tense, let me rephrase. I still today see many Christians who, instead of attracting people to Jesus, do exactly the opposite. Remember what Gandhi once said. He said, I would be a Christian if it wasn't for the Christians. There is often so much about us which puts people off from coming to Jesus. The ways that we insist on living and not shedding sometimes repel people from Jesus instead of having the opposite effect. And you know what? That's an issue for me. I saw one of my friends put on Facebook the other day something that disturbed me quite a bit. He is going through a whole lot of stuff, and I'm not sure if his belief in God has survived. He's probably quite a bit angry, and part of his anger is the offense and the hurt that the church has caused him. And of course he's made the fatal mistake of confusing the church and Christianity. The two aren't necessarily the same. And Arnold went on and on and on his Facebook wall about how judgmental Christians are, how harsh, and how resentful. I didn't reply to that because I didn't know what to say, but somebody else wrote a comment. And more than being disturbed by what Arnold wrote, this other person's reply to him got to me more. For whoever this person was said to him, Arnold, you always need to remember that Christianity isn't Jesus' fault. And that provoked a whole lot of thinking on my side. It's never left my mind since I saw it about 10 days ago. Sometimes we live a Christianity which doesn't look like Christ at all. And unfortunately, there are too many of that kind of believers still around. Believers who are bitter, believers who are over the top, believers who are filled with self-righteousness and pride and arrogance, and the way in which they serve Jesus is just flat out wrong. And I can understand why some people don't want to get close to Jesus with the 10-foot pole, because some of the people who bear his name are causing much more harm than he can. The Bible has a word for that kind of person. It's called Pharisee. And so I think the time has probably come for us to do a little bit of self-examination this Easter. Asking ourselves what kind of Jesus follower we are. Many people have persuaded themselves that they are the best kind of Christian ever. I think that every now and then I fall into that trap. But I want to investigate my life this Lenten season. And I want to confess of every way in which I have made it difficult for people to come to Jesus, even while trying very hard to do the opposite. And maybe this is something that we all have to consider on this. There is an exquisite verse in John chapter 3. Are people still listening? Or are you sitting in your seat silently hoping for a speck of dust to fall into my eye? I'm almost done. We'll get out of here by 12:15. 12:12-ish. Okay? 11:15. What did I say? 12:12. Freudian slip. 11:15. You must know what I meant. I was saying before you so rudely interrupted, there's an exquisitely beautiful verse in John 3, verse 30, where John makes it clear to his audience that it's not about him. That the big fuss needs to be made about Jesus and not him. He was just the forerunner, the leveler of the way, the one setting the scene. And so he says this, and it's such a haunting verse. He says, I remind myself every day, all day, that I must decrease and that Jesus must increase. And so if that's not what we need to seek for our lives, then I don't know what is. John constantly had to remind himself, and we constantly have to remind ourselves, that if we are to win a world for Jesus, that is what it's going to take. For ourselves to decrease and for Jesus to always increase in us and through us. You know what I pray in that 10-second period before a service? You see me standing here, right? And bowing my head. I don't quickly at the last minute say, Lord, please hold the church for 10 o'clock. No. There is a prayer that I have prayed for 25 years now. Every time I stand in a pulpit ready to proclaim the good news. You know what I pray? Because I know you wondered about this. Here it is. Every single service, I start with, as I stand here, saying, Lord, let the gospel be preached, not because of me, but in spite of me. And that is how we should live intentionally every day, for the gospel to be expressed by us, the love of Jesus to ooze out of us, not because of us, but in spite of us. The Bible in the New Testament doesn't only mention crowds in the Gospels. When you look at Mark, when you look at Matthew, when you look at Luke, even at John, who's not a synoptic, you will see that crowds were everywhere, following Jesus all the time. But those are not the only crowd that the New Testament speaks of. In the book of Revelation, there is reference to another crowd. Could be chapter 5, chapter 4, somewhere there. Not 100% certain now, but you can look it up. John, who wrote about this vision he was given while on the Greek Isle of Patmos in exile, describes this revelation that God gave him at the time. And it talks about this enormous crowd in the hall of heaven. Right at the center of the throne room of God, there sits Jesus, the Lamb that was slain. And John says, never before have you seen a crowd this size. And then he goes as far as saying that everybody's eyes in this throne room, with this massive throng of people, that everybody's eyes are fixed only on one person, the one right in the middle, namely Jesus the Christ. No one is looking up at the ceiling. No one is looking at their neighbor. Everybody is looking at Jesus, the one who died and rose again. Now, can you imagine the thrill when we get there, when we get to be a part of that crowd and spot other faces? Can you imagine the thrill that we will get if we spot other faces in that crowd who are there because of us?